You wake up, and before you brush your teeth, before you say good morning to anyone, before you even fully open your eyes, you reach for your phone. Not because something urgent happened, not because you were expecting an important message. You just reach for it, like a reflex, like breathing. And here is the thing that should stop you cold. You know it makes you feel worse. You know that 10 minutes on social media before breakfast leaves you anxious, distracted, and somehow already behind. Even before your day has started, you know this. And you still do it, every single morning. Now imagine that you are not a tired adult trying to manage stress and deadlines. Imagine you are 13 years old. Your brain is still being built. Your identity is still being formed. And this same device, with this same pull, is in your hand from the moment you wake up until the moment you fall asleep, with it sitting right there on your nightstand. That is not a metaphor. That is the daily reality of an entire generation of American kids. And according to one of the most talked about books of the last few years, it is quietly reshaping what it means to grow up. The book is The Anxious Generation, written by Jonathan Haidt, a social psychologist and professor at New York University's Stern School of Business, and one of the most respected researchers on moral psychology and social behavior in the country. Haidt has spent decades studying how culture shapes the human mind. And in this book, he makes a case that is difficult to argue with once you see the data. Something went seriously wrong with childhood in America and across much of the Western world right around the year 2012. Anxiety, depression, loneliness, and self-harm among teenagers did not gradually creep upward. They spiked. And they spiked in a way that lines up almost perfectly with the moment smartphones became standard equipment for adolescents. The big idea is this. We replaced a childhood built on real-world experience with one built on screens, and we are only beginning to understand the cost. There is one idea near the end of this script that reframes the entire conversation, and it is not the one most people expect. It is not about banning phones or blaming parents. It is something quieter and, honestly, something more hopeful. Stay with me because it is worth getting there. If the kind of thinking in this video is what you are looking for, subscribe. This is what we do here, breaking down the books that actually change how you see the world. Here's what Haidt means when he talks about a great rewiring. For most of human history, children learned how to be human by doing things in the real world, by climbing trees, getting scraped up, navigating friendships face to face, feeling embarrassed in public, figuring out conflicts without an adult stepping in every 5 minutes. That kind of experience was not just play, it was training. It was how young brains learned to handle discomfort, read social situations, take calculated risks, and recover from failure. It was uncomfortable, unpredictable, and absolutely essential. Then, gradually at first and then all at once, that world shrank. Parents, understandably worried about safety in a media environment that made every danger feel immediate and catastrophic, began pulling kids inside. Playgrounds emptied. Neighborhoods went quiet. Kids stopped walking to school alone, stopped spending unsupervised afternoons with friends, stopped having the kinds of low-stakes adventures that build resilience. And into that vacuum came the screen, portable, endlessly stimulating, and available every waking hour. By the early 2010s, the average American teenager was spending somewhere between 7 and 9 hours a day looking at a screen, not counting time in school. And much of that time was spent on social platforms designed, at a fundamental level, to keep them there as long as possible. Haidt draws a line between two kinds of childhood, and the contrast is striking. He calls one play-based and the other phone-based. A play-based childhood is messy, social, embodied, and full of real consequences. A phone-based childhood is mediated, curated, endlessly scrollable, and emotionally intense in a very specific, very narrow way. And the research Haidt assembles suggests that when you trade one for the other, during the years when the brain is most plastic and most vulnerable, something goes wrong. Not for every kid, not in exactly the same way, but at a population level, the signal is hard to ignore. Now, one of the most important things Haidt points out is that this did not hit boys and girls the same way, and understanding that difference changes how you see the problem entirely. For adolescent girls, the damage came primarily through social comparison and relational aggression. Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, these platforms turned social life into a performance, a continuous public display of how you look, who you are with, what your life feels like from the outside. And for a 13 or 14-year-old girl whose brain is wired to care deeply about belonging and social status, that kind of environment is not just stressful. It is relentless. There is no off switch. There is no going home at the end of the school day and leaving the social drama behind. It follows you into your bedroom, into your bed, at 2 a.m, dressed up as a notification. The data Haidt presents on this is sobering. Rates of anxiety and depression among American teenage girls nearly doubled between 2012 and 2018. Rates of self-harm went up sharply. Hospitalizations for eating disorders climbed. And these were not slow generational trends. They were sudden. They were steep. And they happened in countries across the developed world at roughly the same time, which is exactly what you would expect if the cause was something that crossed borders all at once, like a smartphone in every teenager's pocket. For boys, the story is different but no less serious. Boys tend to retreat. Where girls often become hyper-connected and overwhelmed by social performance, boys disengage, pulling back from school, from friendships, from ambition, sinking instead into video games and online content that offers stimulation and reward without any of the friction of real life. Haidt describes this as a kind of collective withdrawal, a generation of young men who are spending more and more time in virtual worlds while their real-world skills, their ability to compete, commit, and connect, quietly atrophy. And before you dismiss this as laziness or weak parenting, consider this. These platforms were not designed to be easy to put down. They were engineered that way. That is a meaningful distinction. This is where the book takes a turn that a lot of readers did not expect, and it is one of the most debated points you will find in any review of this book online. The question people keep asking is, but what about adults? Adults are just as addicted to their phones. Why is this only a problem for teenagers? And it is a fair question. Haidt addresses it directly. The answer comes down to one word: development. An adult brain that spends too much time on social media might become distracted, anxious, or less productive. That is real, and it is worth taking seriously. But an adolescent brain that grows up inside these platforms during the years when identity, emotional regulation, and social skills are being literally constructed, that is a different category of harm. It is not the same as an adult choosing a bad habit. It is more like building a house on a cracked foundation. The problems do not always show up right away, but they show up. Haidt makes a point that is almost impossible to shake once you hear it. He talks about what he calls the asymmetry of protection, the fact that we have become extremely cautious about protecting children from physical risk in the real world, while leaving them almost completely unprotected from psychological risk in the digital one. We would never hand a 12-year-old a device that gave them unsupervised access to the most extreme content imaginable in the physical world, to strangers who could contact them at any hour, to a social environment where their appearance and popularity were publicly rated in real time. We would never do that in person. But we handed them a smartphone and called it connection. And here is the pattern interrupt, the thing that should make you stop and sit with this for a second. The anxiety crisis among teenagers is not a mystery. It is not a complex, unsolvable riddle buried in genetics or economics or cultural decline. Haidt argues it has a primary driver that is identifiable, measurable, and, crucially, reversible, which means the conversation does not have to end in helplessness. It can end in something far more useful, and that is exactly where this goes next. So what does Haidt actually propose? Because this is the part of the book that surprises most people, and it is the idea that was planted all the way back at the beginning of this conversation. The solution is not what the headlines make it sound like. It is not a simple ban all phones argument, though Haidt does believe smartphones should be kept out of middle schools entirely, and the evidence behind that position is strong. The deeper answer is something more fundamental and, in a strange way, more. Haidt calls it restoring the foundations of a healthy childhood, and what he means by that is giving children back something that was quietly taken from them without anyone really deciding to take it, the experience of navigating the real world on their own terms. He lays out 4 specific norms that he believes parents, schools, and communities need to rebuild together, and the word together is doing a lot of work in that sentence, because Haidt is clear that none of this works if only a handful of families opt in while everyone else stays on the same path. The first norm is no smartphones before high school. Not a flip phone, not a restricted smartphone, not a smartphone with parental controls that a 12-year-old can bypass in 40 seconds. A basic phone for calls and texts is fine. A portal to the entire internet, to social media, to strangers, to algorithmically curated content designed to maximize engagement at the expense of everything else is not. The second norm is no social media before the age of 16. The third is phone-free schools, not just classrooms where phones sit face down on desks, but schools where phones are stored away from the moment students arrive to the moment they leave. And the fourth norm is the one that ties everything together: far more unsupervised time in the real world, more independence, more physical freedom, more opportunities for children to take small risks, make real decisions, and experience real consequences without an adult immediately stepping in to smooth everything over. Now, a lot of parents who read this book have the same reaction, which is something like, "I agree with all of this, but I cannot do it alone. If I take my kid's phone away and no one else does, my kid just becomes the one left out." And Haidt takes that concern seriously. He is not asking individual families to sacrifice their children's social lives at the altar of a principle. He is asking for collective action, for parents to talk to other parents, for schools to adopt clear policies, for communities to rebuild the shared norms that once made a certain kind of childhood not just possible, but normal. Because here is what the research consistently shows. When groups of parents move together, when schools commit to phone-free environments across the board, kids adjust. They find each other, they talk, they get bored, and then they get creative. They become, in small but measurable ways, more themselves. This is the part of the book that lands the hardest, and it is the idea worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Haidt is not arguing that technology is evil or that smartphones are the enemy of everything good. He is making a narrower, more precise, and ultimately more urgent point. The years between 10 and 20 are a critical window. What happens to a child's brain during that window? What experiences shape it? What stresses it is exposed to? What relationships it builds? What risks it is allowed to take? All of that has consequences that stretch decades into the future. And right now, for millions of American kids, that window is being filled almost entirely by a screen, by platforms that were built not with their well-being in mind, but with engagement metrics, by a digital environment that is, in Haidt's own framing, a social world that no previous generation of humans ever had to navigate. The cost of that is showing up in therapists' offices and emergency rooms and college counseling centers across the country. It is showing up in the faces of young people who seem connected to everyone and genuinely close to no one. It is showing up in a generation that has more information than any generation in history and less certainty about who they are than perhaps any generation in recent memory. But here is what Haidt wants you to leave with, and it is not despair. The brain is plastic. Relationships are healable. Communities can rebuild norms faster than most people think when there is a shared understanding of what is at stake. The anxious generation is not a verdict. It is a description of where things are right now, and descriptions can change. What changes them is not one parent making one decision in isolation. What changes them is enough people looking at the same evidence, deciding that a different kind of childhood is worth fighting for. If this book has been sitting on your radar, the link to get your own copy is in the comments below. Haidt goes much deeper into the data, the case studies, and the specific recommendations than any summary can. And there are chapters in this book that deserve to be read slowly, more than once, ideally with other parents or educators in the room. The question Haidt leaves you with is simple, and it is the one worth sitting with tonight. Not what do we do about our kids' phones? That is the surface question. The deeper one is this: what kind of childhood do we actually believe children deserve? Because how you answer that, not in theory but in practice, in the decisions you make this week and next month and next year, that is what will determine what the next generation looks like. And that answer belongs to all of us.